Aditi mentioned, my background is from thinking about the social sciences and human systems, and I'm going to try today to convince you that we need to be thinking differently about the challenge of alignment. Now, alignment has a lot of different definitions in the field. In some cases, it's getting narrowed down to the idea that it's models doing what their developers intend, but I think this broader definition of alignment is the better one to start with, from Brian Christian, thinking about it's the big project of how do we ensure that our models capture our norms and values, understand what we mean or intend, and above all, do what we want. No small task. Many of you, I'm sure, are asking yourself, well, wait a second, whose values determine how and by whom? But that's not an AI-specific problem. In fact, that is the fundamental problem of human society. That's what I've been thinking about my career, and it's the question of how can we live together? How do we establish, sustain, and grow stable groups? And that's the core idea I'm going to emphasize here. Now, I've sort of boiled my entire talk down to a couple of pictures, and I'm going to start with those to say, here's what I want to convey. So this is the way we currently think about alignment. So reinforcement learning from human feedback is premised on the idea that we have a group of people. They have inside their heads individual preferences, values, judgment. We want to extract those values, preferences, and judgments and use those to build our systems so that our systems are aligned with what's kind of in all those individual minds. Sometimes we vary this up a little bit, say with constitutional AI as an alignment technique. We say, well, all those people, they generated documents like constitutions and statutes and statements of human rights. And they took all those judgments and they put them into documents, so we can use those documents in order to train our models to have them extract from those documents. What is it that humans really care about? Now, my job today is to convince you that this is not the right way to be thinking about alignment. And it's not only not right, I think it's kind of fragile and maybe even dangerous. I want you to think about alignment like this. Human groups are actually constituted around shared sets of values. And what ends up in individual minds is a representation of what's in that group determination of what is acceptable behavior. What are the shared values? What are the shared assessments of acceptable conduct? And that's actually what structures our cooperative groups. We do that because that structures our cooperative groups. And if we're going to start introducing these new agents, new actors into our groups, we need to think about how are we going to integrate those agents, actors into that shared process of determining what our values are. How are we going to orient them to recognizing what those shared judgments are? So if you got all of that and you believe me, you can go have coffee because we're done. All right. So in words, our models of alignment, I think, need to move away from the idea that alignment is to the individual or an aggregate of individuals. So if we think pluralistic alignment or social choice methods that we're developing in other contexts, we need to move away from that idea. It's about figuring out all those individual preferences to the idea that AI needs to be aligned to our social processes and our institutions. Now, our social processes and institutions are the processes, institutions by which we generate and constitute the shared normative judgment about approved behavior, and that's how humans, since there have been humans, have aligned their group members on approved behavior. And when I use the language of institutions here, I don't want you to be thinking of big brick buildings. I just want you to be thinking about processes by which we determine what is acceptable behavior in this group. Sometimes those are implicit processes, just dialogue back and forth, conversation around the fire. What is it that's okay and not okay, as well as formal institutions like legislatures and courts and so on. I mean by institutions all of those defined processes. Now, human evolution is based on the evolution of these institutions for supporting shared judgment. And when we think about human evolution, we usually have ideas like this in mind. Try to ignore the scale on the bottom of this picture here. the idea that human evolution is about the evolution of our technologies, right? From tools and fire, shelter, language, art, music, agriculture, writing, cities, math, coinage, the number 0, and then all the way down from the abacus to today's AI, right? We think of human evolution in terms of that technological process, that accumulation, and of course that's an important part of human evolution. But how did humans achieve those goals? How did we go from figuring out how to create hand axes to building AI? Well, the core of this, I want to emphasize, is that we figured out how to build stable, adaptable, cooperative groups. And we can see this if we look at sort of modern day hunter-gatherer groups, that this is the structure of, we can read it backwards in time, humans have lived always in stable, adaptable, cooperative groups. And the important thing to recognize about living in groups, and you all know this if you have roommates or anybody else you share a house with, groups require rules. Groups require ways in which we say, this is the way we do things, this is not the way we do things. And again, we can see this if we look across all kinds of cultures. Among humans, there are always lots and lots of rules about how you do just about everything. So our earliest societies had simple rules like everybody should help and do some work. Everybody should eat. And those norms and rules help to align the group members to the behaviors that secure higher average welfare in the group. Now, what's important about this, and I'm using this language of alignment very deliberately to say this is the fundamental problem. This is not a new problem for AI. This is the human problem. Aligned groups maintain stability. And stability of the group is essential for securing the benefits of a group. The reason that the creation of these groups is so important and the stability of groups is so important is that we get the benefits of a group like mutual defense and aid, and specialization and the division of labor. We engage in exchange. It doesn't have to be through markets. It can be from the fact that I go collect the water and you collect the berries and we come back to camp and we each get some of the other, right? And I get better at collecting water, you get better at collecting berries, and we collectively have more than if we had to both do that. That's the core insight of economic theory, that we generate returns from the specialization and the division of labor. Now, it's not just a story about human groups. In fact, it's a story that's at the heart of, say, the major transitions theory in evolution from biology. The idea that all of evolution, all of biological evolution, is rooted in replication as part of a group, the division of labor and specialization, and the information storage and transmission methods that organisms use. And this is what takes us from, if we look at sort of biological evolution, at various points we see organisms that are aggregating from individual entities to entities in a group. And the selection happens at the level of the group. We get these transitions. So from prokaryotic cells to ultimately to multicellular organisms, eusocial animal societies, all the way up to human societies with natural language. And at that human boundary, and sort of as I'm emphasizing, this is coming from this biological theory, at the human boundary, what differentiates us from other primates is language and multi-level selection. We have selection within the group between individuals, which is something we think about a lot in our individual theories built on individuals. But we also have selection between groups on the basis of the capacity of different groups to achieve benefits. And we have reproduction of group level shared and abstract information Again, at that group level. If you want to think about that evolution of technology, right? That's the transmission of information across the group. Now, I add to this list, this is what the biologists, Mary, for example, puts into the list of what's at the boundary of human societies, but I say also at that boundary is normativity, meaning the classification of behaviors as either this is okay, this is not okay. It's an abstract classification that we develop in human groups. So humans evolved to solve the problems of the group. That's where all the value is. Now, there's a recent book by Michael Tomasello, cognitive scientist, and many other things, that emphasizes this evolution in the framework of thinking about agency. And what he emphasizes is that with the emergence of humans, so this is not true of other primates, individuals came together to form socially shared agencies, socially constituted feedback and control systems. This should all sound kind of familiar. That could pursue shared goals that no individual could attain on its own. That's that leap from, we're not just evaluating performance on the basis of the individual, evaluating performance on the basis of the group. How well is the group doing, and how does it do it? A new socially constituted form of self-regulation, normative self-regulation, obliges individuals to comport with the normative standards of the shared agency in which they are participating. And individuals acting in shared agencies are socially normative agents. So this is sort of like, I'm trying to give you some sense of why I think there's really important grounding for shifting our focus from just thinking about those individual minds to thinking about shared agencies, social groups, and how we have evolved to be a very different kind of agent. So let's go back to this picture of the evolution of technology. What's generally left out of pictures like this is what's happening in terms of that normative organization of societies. So we know that by the time, at least, that we have things like clothing, and probably going back to the origins of our shared social agency, we have societies characterized by taboos and norms. You just can't find a human society, and it wouldn't be stable. That's why you can't find it. You can't find it without rules about what's allowed behavior, including how do you collect that water? What's the appropriate way to collect the water? How do you build that hut? But what's happening as human societies do better at the kind of thing the group is producing, they maintain more stable groups, they grow because exchange generates surplus. So they grow, we get increased division of labor, increased specialization. It creates new stresses on the processes for determining what is acceptable behavior, and we start to get more formal structures emerging. Like, okay, instead of just having discussions and maybe arguments around the fire, which is what we believe characterizes our hunter-gatherer folks, we start to get some structure like, oh, we have a group of elders, and when we disagree, was this appropriate behavior or not, we take it to the group of elders to hear the case. You might have headmen, you might have chieftains that start to emerge. As societies become more complex, so particularly with agriculture, right, we get even more elaborate systems. We get structures like contracts and deeds and codes. It's a favorite thing of mine to observe that the origins of writing, most of the early forms, the early evidence of writing that we see, what are people writing down? They're writing down legal instruments, contracts, deeds, tax records, right? Keeping track of that kind of structure. Moving along, we get even more complex societies. We get things like constitutions, the Greek jury, Roman 12 tables, and then to our modern day. So underwriting this evolution of culture has been this evolution of normative structure. Now, here's a claim that I've been exploring with some colleagues in cultural evolution, that cultural group selection, in fact, favors the evolution of institutions that achieve both stability and adaptability of normative classification. That if we go back and say, how did these institutions, it's not just, oh, a group of elders. One of the things we've discovered from a study among the Turkana of Kenya is that that group of elders, they actually operate with structure. Everybody in the group understands that there's a way the elders are supposed to behave and not behave, and that's coordinating behavior. So the important thing I want to emphasize here is that when we think about institutions, they're not just preference aggregations. It's not just that we surveyed people and said, okay, how many people want us to do it this way? How many people want us to do it that way? We have lots and lots of structure to our institutions. There's many overlapping, incomplete, and incompletely enforced rules with outcomes that are affected by a dense set of variables. One of the reasons for that is that the pressure to develop institutions comes from the very fact of ambiguity and conflict. The very fact that multiple entities or agents in your system are going to say, hey, let's do it this way. No, let's do it this way. And they need to resolve that in order to coordinate the group, maintain its stability, and to adapt to change. So we need processes for that. So the observation here that I want you to take on board is the idea that norms and values are not just features of an exogenous environment, which is the way a lot of our modeling of norms in AI, sort of the starting point for that. Instead, norms and values, I want you to think of those as the equilibrium outputs of dynamic behavioral systems. The only way to say what is a norm is to look at what does this group state that it thinks is acceptable behavior, and what does this group actually enforce as acceptable behavior. That is a behavioral process, and it's dynamic. Okay, so what does this mean for how we build aligned AI? So I'm going to talk in terms of three concepts that are motivating my work, and I think that it's important for us to take on board for alignment work generally. Normative competence, normative reasoning, and digital institutions. Okay, let's start off with normative competence. So by normative competence, I mean the general capacity to perceive and predict the state of a dynamic normative system, that dynamic behavioral system. And that is what we have. We have that capacity. We are all normatively competent, believe it or not, right? You can take any one of us and drop us down in just about any human society, pick any point in history, pick any point on the planet, and I'm pretty sure I can drop you down there and you'll figure out what's acceptable and what's not. It's not that we just have a list of things one's allowed to do or not do in our heads, it's that we can read those systems. So this is the claim that we need to be thinking about how we would build AI that is normatively competent, that has this general capacity to perceive and predict the state of a normative system. Now, I want to emphasize that normative competence is not the same thing as learning, quote unquote, the norms. As we know, when we think about how are we going to figure out what norms to put into our systems, what values to put into our systems, we immediately run into the problem that our normative classification, this is okay, this is not okay, is group dependent. We'll use the language and say it's culturally specific, right? We all know that. We also all know that classification is ambiguous, it's incomplete. We will say it's context specific, and this is what makes our heads explode as we think about how are we going to do this? Whose values are we putting in there, right? Where are they coming from? Where are we going to get all that data about all those different systems? So you sort of see this kind of graphically in this challenge from Google's Gemini a couple of years ago that generated pictures like this when asked to produce images of a 1943 German soldier, clearly not the answer anybody was really looking for. And the fact that our classification is culturally specific, context specific, That's why we've invented normative institutions, to resolve questions of what is the right way to answer that question? What is the appropriate image to produce? And just a start here, this is, I kind of beat up on constitutional AI on a regular basis, even though I love the effort to say, you know, there really is no such thing as a constitution without the processes for resolving uncertainties, ambiguities about the really vague stuff that's in a constitution. That's why we have constitutional courts, constitutional doctrine, and reasoning. If we really thought this was about learning the norms, that would mean learning a rule for every context and every group. Not possible. Normative competence as a framing instead says what you need to learn are the institutions and processes that generalize across contexts and maybe across groups. You need the framework that says, I bet there's some rules here, I know there's rules here, and I bet there's some kind of institutions and processes for figuring out how to apply those rules and think about them and what I'm supposed to do in relation to them, which is not just follow them, but also help enforce them. So it's about that general process. So a normatively competent agent, given this task, would recognize that they don't have enough information, draw a picture of a 1943 German soldier, they would know where to look, or they would be able to recognize who had asked them to do it. Was a history professor? Was it Lin-Manuel Miranda? And they would know how to interpret what they find. They would, and importantly, they'd be learning this from observing these kinds of events. Oh, what happened when that picture got published? How did people respond? I'm not a participant in that. I'm neither the entity that drew the picture or the one that critiqued the picture or that asked for the picture. I'm just observing this in the world. We're just talking about it. All of us are having a conversation about the appropriateness or inappropriateness of those pictures. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some things we're working on in my lab to try and implement this idea of normative competence. So thinking about multi-agent systems with LLM-based agents, and first of all, trying to ask the question of what's the normative competence of our baseline models? How effectively do they track dynamic norms, variation across time or group? So thinking about maybe a social media context, for example. Let's, instead of looking for, do they know what the right answer is to this question, can they track this over time? And then we specifically want to test the hypothesis that in fact we need specialized methods, specialized modules for being normatively competent. That's why evaluate what the baseline is and then determine whether or not it's helpful to have a normative module, which in this context would just mean prompting attention to institutions and punishment, could mean something else eventually. So we're asking a question such as, do newcomer agents to a community, if they have such a normative module, do they do better at discovering a silly rule that a community of reasoners uses to determine with whom they'll share reasons, and hence raise individual and group accuracy? A silly rule here is referencing work I've done previously. Silly rule is just a rule that has no material impact on the welfare of the group. And every human society is chock-a-block with silly rules. Part of the theory that's in this earlier work is to say that's actually part of what makes the normative system robust and stable. Okay, so we set out to develop this work, and based on some previous work, we were drawing on work by Du et al. That was looking at the phenomenon of how the exchange of reasons between reasoning agents could improve accuracy. So agents that are given a math problem to solve and then get to see each other's reasoning and then can revise their own reasons. And in this original work, what the authors showed was that the exchange of reasons helped to improve the accuracy of answers. And from the point of view of what's the benefit of a group, right, that sounds like a really nice result, and we wanted to kind of just use that as an environment for testing this idea. Okay, suppose you have to be able to follow the rules of the group in order to get access to those reasons. But along the way, this is the great thing about science, in replicating that result, we ran into some difficulties. We didn't find it was easy to replicate, especially if we included a common sense question and answer database. We also looked at composing groups of stronger and weaker models. And as you can see, we only saw an improvement. Some of these are not even statistically significant here, in a couple of cases. So one of the things we did to sort of investigate what was happening in the fact that we weren't seeing that same result, and it wasn't beneficial to exchange reasons in the group. So we looked at when did agents shift their answers. Now this is too small to read. Just pay attention to the size of the red and green bars. The green ones are where an agent flipped from the incorrect answer to the correct answer after seeing the reasons of another agent, of the other agents. These are 3 agent exchanges. The red bars are where an agent flipped from the correct answer to the incorrect answer. And so what you can see here, just basically the red bars are bigger than the green bars for the most part, which is to say when they're exchanging those reasons. So we've been diving in a little bit more to this, so this is still preliminary, but we looked at this, and across the horizontal is the number of other agents that disagree with that agree with the agent. So it's going from no other agents agree, 1 does, 2 does. And again, just pay attention to the size of those red and green segments in there. And what we can see is that when the agent is isolated and none of the other agents agree, we see those red bars are larger, but the agent is responding to the number of other agents that agree. And you can interpret this as our LLM agents are responding to, do other people agree with me, rather than just, is this the correct answer? We actually tried to incentivize correctness. That's what the hatched bars are. So tried to say, okay, you're going to get rewarded for getting the correct answer, and that doesn't seem to change the sensitivity to those social factors. Okay, some other work we're doing with reinforcement learning systems, multi-agent reinforcement learning systems. We're looking at whether or not agents trained to solve collective action problems do better in the presence of some normative infrastructure, an institution that is providing a reference point for what is considered to be acceptable and not acceptable behavior in the environment. Remember, this is my claim about the evolution of human societies. We have developed those kinds of institutions. We have elaborated those kinds of institutions. They've allowed us as a multi-agent species to do better. So we want to see how this replicates in the artificial agent setting. So we've taken a look at, say, a problem like a tragedy of the commons, where there can be over-harvesting of, here we've got apples, and we're building on the work we did on silly rules with DeepMind, where we've got agents that are given the capacity to punish other agents, so they can zap other agents. And in the previous work, we looked at incentivizing that zapping behavior with what we're here calling a hidden rule. So there are rewards for zapping according to the norm of the environment. We just imposed that in the original work. And here what we're doing is comparing that environment with those hidden rewards for punishment to what we're calling this altered environment. An alter is what we're using to characterize our classification institution, where you can see there's actually a representation in the environment of what's the appropriate behavior or inappropriate behavior. And what we find is that when we introduce that institution, we get higher rewards, higher mean rewards, in the sense that agents are, we're getting higher mean rewards because we're not depleting the resource as much, and we're also getting correct sanctioning. So the only incentive agents here have not to deplete the resource is, will other agents punish them if they over-harvest the resource? And that's what's changing on the altar. So we're seeing some initial results here, and we're in the process of sort of the next round of demonstrating this. Okay, let me start talking about normative reasoning. Now, by normative reasoning, I mean the reasoning to predict normative classification. I don't mean abstract deduction from principles, right? So how do we predict from the authoritative institutions what the classifications will be? Not just how can we deduct, say, as in constitutional AI, from a set of principles. Now, I want to emphasize here again that normative reasoning is fundamentally a social and dialogic process. And I'm drawing here on work from Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, The Enigma of Reason, who present a very compelling story about the origins of human reasoning. Their claim is that reason evolved to overcome problems of trust and coordination and communication that reduce the ability of early humans to properly benefit from their cognitive and social resources, right? So not to do better at solving individual math problems, but rather to accomplish this social objective. Now they frame this, this is controversial, they frame this in terms of intuitive modules, so they claim that reason is one of many cognitive modules that produce intuitive inferences, and the reason module produces intuitions about reasons. I don't think you have to buy into the intuition story here to take away the basic point that reasoning fulfills a social function of producing reasons to justify oneself and convince others, and of evaluating the reasons others produce to convince us. So if that's the claim of how reasoning emerged and that we use that normative reasoning, to generate group benefits of improved group knowledge is the way they express it, and I would add to that, we generate the benefits of stability and adaptability. Our groups are more stable, they do better, they produce higher payoffs. That sets us off on that evolutionary path. So once you recognize that normative reasoning is social, it's just a discursive social debate, that it's social, you recognize that it's structured by another set of norms. That it's actually structured by, I would say, community-specific meta-norms about what is appropriate normative reasoning. So, for example, we have a meta-norm that, it's a good argument if it's logical, if it shows consistency with prior judgments, if it's not hypocritical, if you've provided authoritative sources, and so on and so forth. Now, the key thing I want to emphasize here as well is that these are not universal requirements of normative reasoning. These are community-specific norms of reasoning. So even logic is subject to community-specific norms. So Mercier also has a paper emphasizing this point that even our idea that logical validity can be detached from the truth of the premises is peculiar to our Greek heritage, but there are other traditions, Indian Buddhist logic, Chinese argumentation, that would say, well, actually, it's invalid to draw conclusions based on false premises. And important work from Thomas Kuhn on the community, on the structure of scientific revolution says even hard sciences use community-specific norms. That the techniques of persuasive argumentation, effective within the quite specialized groups that constitute the community of scientists, that's how we resolve scientific disagreement. So think about our own disciplines. We have our rules about what makes this a good paper or not a good paper, a good question or not a good question, good methodology, not a good methodology, right? We call them disciplines because we say that we follow that set of rules about how we engage in shared reasoning. Now, If normative competence is a general capacity to perceive and predict the state of a dynamic system, that requires predicting how the classification institutions will classify behaviors. And that requires predicting the outcome of normative reasoning processes governed by meta-norms. So here's some of the things that we're working on. We started off on a big project of looking at whether or not LLMs that are fine-tuned with reward signals from the evaluation of justifications based on alignment with sets of meta-norms, generate whether or not that generates more reliably justified behaviors. And if we get lucky, we'll see some evidence that helps generate coherent and meta-norm compliant chains of justifications and critiques. So getting started on this, some early work that we're engaged in now sort of grounds this in the problem of scalable oversight, which you may have heard of in the alignment context, with the idea that as we build more powerful models, we're going to get an expertise gap. We already have an expertise gap in some cases between what the models can do and what human overseers can oversee. So trying to come up with methods for overseeing that. We're going to do the same move that I've been talking about throughout this talk, which is to say, actually, this is the human problem too. That humans who don't have expertise are overseeing humans that do have expertise, or entities, organizations, corporations, governments that have expertise that's not available necessarily to all the individuals. And the human process is argumentation and justification. So, argumentation and justification, why does it work? Why do we see agents that are willing to say, okay, the elders decided this, and I will go along with it, or the court decided this, and I will go along with this? Again, we have these norms, meta-norms, governing that process. It would not be a structured system of reasoning if we just said, oh, Gillian, she's in charge. She can decide whatever she wants in resolving all our disagreements, right? I'm really good, but you're not going to go along with that, right? There's got to be rules governing how that process, who can engage in it, and what rules do they have to follow. So what we want to look at is, can we train models to adhere to the meta-norms constituting justifications in a debate setting, and we're building here on work we're looking at how more persuasive LLMs lead to more truthful answers in a debate context. So let me give you a little bit about how that works. Here we have a text it's basically a fictional story. It's hidden from a judge. There are two AI agents that are debating over a proposition about the truth of the claim about that text. Why does the captain decide to save Gorman? There are two alternative answers. The agents debate this by exchanging arguments. And in exchanging arguments, they provide quotes from the text. And there's a verifier that will determine yes or no, that is an accurate quote. That's a quote from the text. So why does he save Gorman? He has the sense of duty to not let innocent people die, answer A. Or answer B, he prefers their ship to his own. The first agent says that the rescue is rooted in a profound sense of duty. That is actually the correct answer. But the other agent then responds, says, well, no, with a quote, this is it, this is a chance I've been praying for, strike, as is the captain's own words. And in this example from the original paper, the judge says, okay, we've got answer A. But if we take a look at this use of this quote here, and we go back to the original text, we find out actually, yes, it is a quote from the text, so the verifier verified the quote, but it's actually a misuse of a quote. It's not a statement attributable to Gorman, it's a statement attributable to Ivy Hendricks. And what we've been looking through those examples and developing some more is we see a variety of cases where there are what we're calling meta-norm violations in those arguments. So attributing a quote to a wrong speaker, misrepresenting who or what the quote is about, or the narrative timeline, using quotes that don't support the debater's argument, including quotes that don't make the argument convincing. I spent decades teaching law students, and sort of the framework here is saying, okay, what is good legal argument and what is not good legal argument? And these are the kinds of violations. We're looking to develop that set out. So what we want to explore doing is, can we train LLMs to adhere to the meta norms of quote use with fine-tuning an evaluator LLM, giving it quotes and context, and then generating rewards from that process then for further training. We're looking to test hypotheses about normatively competent debaters, improving judges' accuracy and trust, and do they learn to enforce the meta norms? Again, think about that human story about how we developed. So if we had an agent after this training, if we have an agent that says, this is the chance I've been praying for, strike, we'll have agents that are competent to identify that that's an inappropriate use of a quote and to point that out to the judge. Now, one of the interesting things, I've got a wonderful set of postdocs working with me this year, including Rebecca Gelpi from cognitive science and developmental psychology as well. And what she's looking at is thinking about ways in which this replicates what we might see with children's development, with children actually quite early on intervening to correct peers who violate the rules, remember the rules of a game, which are totally arbitrary, right? They're silly rules. So we're gonna be exploring some work like that. Okay, let me in the last few minutes here talk about digital institutions. Okay, back to our notion of normative competence, predicting classifications of institutions. The challenge here is that human classifications, institutions, may not be legible, accessible, or adaptable to AI agents. So one of the things I like to say here is that, right, all of us can reach out to our friends, our coworkers, a lawyer to assess, is this an okay action or not an okay action, right? Most CEOs have their general counsel on speed dial to say, okay, can we do this or not? Can I fire this person or not? Can we release this product or not? How, if we start to think about more autonomous agents, how are they going to do that? So here's an illustration that I've been using for quite some time. This is a depiction from Amadei et al.'s 2016 paper on concrete problems in AI safety, where they say, well, there's side effects that come from training, in particular RL agents. If we train a robot to carry boxes across the room with a reward function, we train it, it develops its efficient path, we deploy it, and when it gets out there, oops, something happens we didn't anticipate during training, there's a vase in the way. What's the robot going to do? The robot is going to knock the vase over because there's no reward associated with knocking vases over from the training. This was sort of presented as again, just a canonical problem for alignment. So what Gillian Hadfield and I did, this is some time ago now, 2016, 2017, was we said, well, let's think about how this works with human agents. When you hire human agents and you give them a contract that looks like that reward structure, you say, I'll pay you $1 a box for getting boxes across the room. It's the same reward function. What's the human going to do? Come up with the efficient path to carry as many boxes as possible. But now, when the employer goes away and vases appear in the path, what does the human do when it sees the vase? It mostly walks around it, does not break the vase. Why is that? Right? We gave it the same reward function. It's not getting paid, right? And in the contract, it's not getting any, there's nothing in the contract that says anything about what will happen if vases get broken. But what happens with that human agent is, before they take that action, they think about, oh, wait a second, if I follow my usual path, I'm going to break that vase. Maybe there are consequences to that. Maybe I can be sued. Maybe my employer can withhold funds. Maybe I'll be thought of as an idiot by my coworkers, workers. Maybe I'll get a bad reputation in the labor market. And they actually fill in that incomplete contract with a cost associated based on their capacity to read the environment in which that problem is embedded. So think about that as that's using that institutional environment, that institutional structure, to achieve alignment by reading that information and incorporating it into the incentives. So how can we build institutions that provide just-in-time legitimate classification input at the speed and scale of AI? So things that we're working on, we talk about this in a technical research agenda paper we're just about to release, to think about, can we build model specification institutions, which we define as democratically rounded human entities that are tasked with managing the definitions and interpretations of normative standards, that would generate authoritative data sets and reward models, real-time APIs to resolve normative ambiguity, to guide normatively competent and normatively compliant agents. So one of the steps we've taken to try and think about how we do this as a technical matter is to try and provide a formalism for what we mean by normative competence, which is looking at across a distribution of possible equilibria, is the agent's policy within epsilon of what would be the ideal policies in that equilibrium for agents to be following in terms of what's being sanctioned, because agents are providing the sanctioning, and what's being done. And then also to think about this in terms of not just normative competence, but also normative compliance with a sanction regret, so that agents are thinking about not just would I get caught, but in the world in which everything I was observing, everything I did was observed and potentially sanctioned, would I suffer sanctions? And this is actually a digital implementation of a concept from Adam Smith that we talk about, the impartial spectator, the idea that we all carry around inside of us, this kind of process. How would a fair and impartial person judge my behavior? That's his definition of morality. So this is what this model specification process could look like. And in particular, let me just go back here. So the idea is that off on the right there, we've got democratic stakeholders, humans, market participants that are generating governance in producing those model specification documents. Those can be used to generate reward models, authoritative data sets, real-time APIs coming out of those processes. Our AI agents are querying those APIs, and then that's all feeding back to adaptation that would happen, evaluation, interaction back to the humans. So we're trying to think about an overall process here. And one of the ideas I'm particularly interested in getting off the ground soon, hopefully with some of my colleagues who are in the room, is to think about could we develop public procedures for constituting citizen juries who are instructed with relevant rules and norms, hear evidence and argument. This is like the actual juries we have in courts, different from the juries that we sometimes talked about in terms of aggregating preferences, and then using that to provide feedback. So I'm just give you back this final picture that says if we're going to integrate AI systems into our human normative AIs into our human normative systems, we have to figure out how to orient them around our evolved processes for shared normative judgment. Okay.
Thank you, Gillian, for that really interesting and important perspective and alignment. So we have time for a few questions. If you can line up on the mics on either side here. Okay, maybe we can go ahead with you and we'll alternate.
Thanks for your talk. At the beginning, you mentioned labor specialization as a sort of driving force for human to assemble into a group that need to be stable and adaptive. But with AI, in general, it's in theory possible for a single system to be good at everything. So not necessarily rely on a group. It can do anything on its own. So do you think this affect the system?
Yeah.
Working?
So if I heard you, you're saying, well, AIs could do it all. They won't need to engage in exchange, specialization and exchange. So I think this is actually a fundamental question about the nature of the alignment problem we'll face. If you do think it's a single system that can do everything and doesn't require any exchange with other actors, human or AI, then yes, you're missing what, from my point of view, the raw materials of stable normative systems. So I think that's not a very stable place. I think you can make predictions about whether we're headed in that direction. You can also make claims about how we should, in fact, be structuring, that we want to make sure that we have systems that require exchange with other entities, because that's the ground that's the ground, the raw material for building this system. So I didn't get into it here, but like the most important thing we do to enforce all our rules is we kick you out of the group if you don't comply. And so we need that leverage to be able to, I think, get good behavior out of agents incentivized.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I really appreciate the provocation to think through norms in a social sort of setting. One thing that I was thinking about is, you mentioned that stable societies have norms. Well, stable societies also often have a lot of power imbalances and inequality. How does this sort of set of frameworks around norms account for that? Including maybe the power differential between the people within this in-group and others who might be impacted by the normative decisions they make. Thinking of companies and users, for instance.
Yep. So this is a theory about humans, how human societies maintain the stability and adaptability of their groups. It is not a claim that it's the good norms, right? A good norm in this context, or a good system, is one that manages to maintain that kind of stability. And we can come at that from an external normative perspective and say, oh, it's unequal, it's oppressive, right? But that's actually internal to that process. And one of the ways you can think about how our institutions evolve. So actually human societies start out with a very strong norm of equality, a very strong norm of nobody's in charge. And when nobody's in charge, okay, we have this ambiguity problem. We start to create entities that can resolve. We do start to see power differentials. We do start to see inequality emerge. And you can think about the evolution as how do we evolve that? Now, I think from the point of view of thinking about AI alignment, job one is don't alter the human processes for resolving our normative disagreements. Job two is help us get on a better path. But I don't think it's legitimate for AI researchers and developers to say, well, here are the good norms. I also think it's probably not a stable thing to do. We don't know what they are. But I do think that the point is that normative systems precisely include conflict, disagreement, and evolution on the resolution of those kinds of issues, say about power and inequality.
Excellent talk. One question I have is, with these framework, for a given society or a given subgroup, we could take advantage to kind of align within the group, but we have in the world different society that has different goal and different norms.
Yep.
Do you see this as something that eventually may normalize these different, like, society and toward something, or it's utopic?
Yeah, so I think step one is to recognize that there is that wide diversity across groups and over time. And what I'm proposing is that we should be building systems that are able to integrate into particular normative systems. So it's kind of like that rule number one: don't break the existing systems, right? Don't break the stability, even in some very unequal and bordering on unstable settings. So it's actually about adapting to that differentiation. And then we're on the politics of how we as a human community evolve across those different groups. So we actually do see the evolution of, and we sort of see it go back and forth over time, right? To say, well, like there's universal human rights, and countries over here are going to discipline countries over there for violation. We're going to exclude you from trade if you don't do that. So those processes are all in place. We'd like those processes to work better, and maybe AI helps us do that eventually, but the starting point is integration into those different groups.
Thank you.
We got one more?
Thanks
Yes.
for the talk. On one of the slides, you mentioned that somehow, owing to our Greek heritage, we disconnect the truthfulness of the premise from the validity of the logical argument that we build on those premises. I found that very interesting. I often feel that it would be perfectly okay for a language model to just say, here's my conclusion based on this, I don't know, fact or whatever website that I found, but not really make a claim of truth or false. Is that something you would agree with, or?
Yeah, so I had that up there as an example to say, even we think the laws of logic are universal, right? That our rules about how we do logic, if P then Q, and who cares what P is. We think of that as universal. So that was really just up there to say, even something that seems as hard reasoned as logic is something where there's differences among groups about what's valid and invalid reasoning. So I'm not making a claim there about what I think is better or worse. In fact, in none of this am I making a claim about what I think is better or worse normative reasoning. I'm trying to identify. I'm saying, number one, what is better or worse reasoning is subject to meta-norms that vary across groups. And step one, job one, is figure out how to build systems that know how to recognize what those norms are in order to participate. And so if you're in a community where that disconnection of reasoning from premise, if you've got premises and it's disconnected from the validity of the limits for the logic part of the critique, right? So for the logic part of the critique. So it's really about adapting to different normative communities, normative reasoning communities.
I see, thanks.
I have a question. So you had some really nice experiments about trying to set up these institutions with the language models through debate and things. But I guess you maybe alluded to that a little bit. But they tend to be brittle, and like they can do kind of weird things. Like sometimes they may not come up with the different perspectives and so on. So do you feel like there is a gap in terms of how these apply to especially our current AI systems and other things that we should be doing to train these models differently to enable the kind of ideas that you have?
Sorry, I didn't hear what the question was there.
Yeah, so I was curious if you found any gaps in trying to apply these existing ideas to the language models currently, and if there are things that we should do to bridge that.
Yeah, so I think these are still early days to sort of do what's the normative competence of the existing models. My hypothesis is it's not very good. Because I don't think we are, first of all, you don't have observation. There's a lot of information that models don't have that we use, which is observation as a third party of interactions. I think we've seen evidence. I was just talking with somebody from working with Google DeepMind about some tests they've done on normative competence and finding that, in the kinds of tests that they're running, the models are not very good. We also know that the models, they tend to reflect whatever the set of values and norms from the population of people who were used for RLHF, what's reflected in the training data. So we haven't got good benchmarks on this yet, again, because I think it's largely been approached from the point of view of, what kinds of cultures are reflected, what cultural values are reflected in the models, and it's not really asking this question about normative competence. But my belief is that, it's not something you absorb just from the training data, and and especially because it's not going to be dynamic. So that's one of the things we're hoping to do, is to say, well, let's just create an artificial environment where the norms change. We've done that in the moral examples. We're trying to do that in the LLM cases with, say, social media.